Good afternoon and welcome to the Portland Art Museum. I'm delighted to see so many of you here today, and I think you made a very wise choice to put away your flip-flops and barbecue sauce from the 4th of July weekend and come in for what's going to be a very tasty lecture in and of itself. It's a great pleasure for me to, I should introduce you myself. I'm Mary Weaver Chapin, curator of prints and drawings. And it's a very great pleasure to introduce Professor Carol Ockman and welcome her to Portland. When Stephanie Parrish in the Learning Department and I sat down, we both independently came up with Carol's name, and it was at the top of both of our lists when we were planning our speaker schedule. So we were delighted Carol could join us here today. Carol is a longtime professor at the Williams College and has focused on modern and contemporary art. She has special interests in the body, trauma, and live performance. Her publications include Angles, Eroticized Bodies, Retracing the Serpentine Line, which was a major publication, very influential on generations of graduate students, myself included, and the marvelous exhibition catalog, Sarah Bernhardt, The Art of High Drama, which is a wonderful read and was also the accompanying publication for a major multimedia exhibition that was held at the Jewish Museum in 2005-2006. Professor Ockman has contributed many lively essays on a wide range of topics, from portraiture to Barbie to stereotypes, as well as much art criticism. She lectures widely at museums, universities, and conferences. Professor Ockman has recently completed a memoir entitled Sarah Bernhardt's Handkerchief, which has also become a one-woman show. Both the performance and the book weave together close encounters with stardom, her father's suicide, and the power of objects. Professor Ockman also has a fascinating role as the curator at large for the Marie Selby Botanical Gardens in Sarasota, Florida, where she gets to work with horticulture and fine art to create a changing living museum. Some of her projects have included Marc Chagall, Flowers in the French Riviera, Warhol, Flowers in the Factory, Gauguin, Voyage to Paradise, and this one sounds particularly exciting. It's entitled Dali, Gardens of the Mind. Yeah. Professor Ockman has recently retired and is a professor emerita from Williams, which means she is doing all sorts of amazing projects. One that really intrigues me as well is that she is collaborating with a dancer and choreographer on a multi-part project she calls Para-Modernities, in which dancers and scholars perform together new works devoted to iconic historic dances. So I'm just delighted Professor Ockman is here today. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much, Mary, for that warm welcome and for the lovely invitation. I also want to thank Stephanie Parrish, Jaleesa Johnston, and Charles Campbell of the museum for their invaluable assistance. Thank you all for coming. It's a delight to see such a large and warm audience. I'd like to dedicate this lecture to the memory of my resilient mother, Ruth Ockman, who died recently at age 98. In the section on Sarah Bernhardt, on the ground floor of the exhibition, there is a small photograph, which you see here on the left, above a vitrine. It shows the actresses Thisbe in Victor Hugo's Angelo, Tyrant of Padua, performed at the Lyric Theater in Philadelphia in 1905. During the same engagement, she would have played her most famous role, Marguerite Gautier, the prostitute with the heart of gold, in La Dame aux Camélias, known as Camille in English. by Alfred Dumas fils. But what's on screen here is actually a still from the 1912 French film version of Camille, directed by Louis Mercanton. Bernhardt's equally famous co-stars Edouard de Max and Lou Telligen are on the left and right, respectively. I introduce my talk with these images for several reasons. They immediately convey Bernhardt's revolutionary, highly physicalized style of acting, seen at the time as uniquely feminine, in contrast to the noble and self-contained, having trouble oh, that's the pointer, that's why I'm not advancing. Well, I hope you saw that. So Bernhardt on the right is in contrast to the noble and self-contained manner of her illustrious precursor, the tragic actress Rachel, and they're both here in the role of Phèdre, for which they were both extremely famous. Let's see how this works in our opening images. So from the profile position of her head, through the jutting hip into the curl of her train, so all the way down here, Bernhardt is completely coiled toward her protagonist. The body is a perfect spiral, her artistic formula, according to the words of composer Rinaldo Hahn, intimate of Bernhardt and Proust. And I quote him, "In all her gestures, one finds the principle of the spiral. Look at the counter movement of her left arm. She hesitates. Her emotion, suggested by the raised glance, comes too from the finger to the lip and the nervous movement of the other hand. In the death scene from Camille on the right, Bernhardt's body is one slow, sensuous curve from head to toe as she falls. Already dead, her face seems magically upturned toward her lover. Her extended arm, slightly bent, consciously echoes the arc of her body. This is high drama and years of experience. These images are also indices of Bernhardt's international career, unrivaled by any actor who lived at the time or preceded her. Born in Paris in 1844, she made 9 tours of the Americas alone and was a sensation throughout Europe and the United Kingdom. Her world tour in 1892 to 1893 added Samoa, Australia, New Zealand, Turkey, Greece, and Senegal to her bucket list. And yet, finally, the stills on the screen document Bernhardt's prescient identification late in her career of film as her passport to immortality. And yet they give us little sense of aspects of the artist's career that are integral to her role as mass media bomb. First, the unlikelihood of her celebrity. And second, its scope and longevity. Nor do they indicate her stature as one of the most represented individuals of her time and the sheer scope of her achievements. Sarah Bernhardt was immortalized by artists from pioneering photographer Félix Nadar on the left to poster wizard Alphonse Mucha, appearing in everything from this 400-pound polychromic marble portrait bust by Jean-Louis Gérôme on the left to a garden planter on the right. Who do you think you are, Sarah Bernhardt? This phrase and its variants, a regular Sarah Bernhardt, Sarah Heartburn, still uttered when children, and especially young girls, throw tantrums, is meant at once to shut them up and to discourage excess or unruliness. In short, the kind of histrionics for which Bernhardt is legend. For some who hear the phrase, however, it encourages the very defiance of conventions that helped to make Bernhardt the greatest actress of the Western world. a rubric frequently coupled with her name during the acme of her success from the late 1870s until her death in 1923. Who Do You Think You Are, Sarah Bernhardt, encapsulates the paradox of an upstart's success. Bernhardt's very origins were a liability. Her mother, Yule van Haag, a Jewish woman of Dutch or German origins, was a courtesan, as was her aunt. And I'll have more to say about Bernhardt's Jewishness later. You see her mother on the left with the young Bernhardt. We still don't know who Bernhardt's father was. On the first page of her autobiography, Ma double vie, My Double Life, published in 1907, Bernhardt refers to him as being in China. She herself had recourse to prostitution early in her career. And even before she had a career, she posed for a series of photographs by the great Nadar, wearing the kind of garment, if you can call it a garment, reserved for models. No points for respectability there. Bernhardt was also deemed promiscuous and said to have had numerous liaisons, including one with the Prince de Ligne, which yielded her only child, Maurice. And that's Maurice on the left. In the center are two of her co-stars, Lou Telligen, whom you saw in the still from Camille in the opening slide on the right. That's Constant Coquelin, one of her co-stars as well. And finally, on the right, acting, a very poor actor at that, the man to whom she was married for less than a year, her only husband, Jacques Damallat. Although her affairs with men are rehearsed by scholars again and again, those with women are rarely mentioned, despite concrete evidence. And on the left is the person I'd call her main squeeze, Bernhardt's long-lived relationship dating from the 1870s was with the painter, rather successful painter, Louise Abema, who appeared at the head of Bernhardt's funeral procession in 1923. You see a photograph on the left and the bronze plaques, each made of the other. Yes, Bernhardt, as you will know from the exhibition, made sculpture, about which more later. This was the only sculpture on the top that Abema ever made. Based on Bernhardt's biography, it's clear then that she defied all conventions of proper womanhood at the time. It's equally clear that she had an uncanny ability to turn these and other drawbacks to her advantage. And on the left, you're seeing two of her very early roles. Her first breeches roles, that kind of means pants roles, Les Passants on the left, and a photograph of her as the queen in Victor Hugo's Ruy Blas. At the start of her career, she had help from her mother, whose circle included Emperor Napoleon III's half-brother, the Duc de Morny, who facilitated Bernhardt's entry into the Conservatoire of the Comédie Française, the most prestigious theater in Paris, certainly, and one of the most in all of Europe. She went on to perform there, then at the Odéon, where she had her first great triumphs in Coppé's Les Passants, or The Passerby, and as the queen in Hugo's Ruy Blas. Returning to the Comédie Française, she had a series of successes in both the classical and romantic repertory, including the titular character of Jean Racine's Phèdre, and on the right, Doña Sol in Hugo's Hernani. By the mid-1870s, Bernhardt was at the pinnacle of her career. As you'll see, she had a lot to do with her own hypervisibility. In 1876, painter Georges Clarin, who walked alongside Louise Abema at Bernhardt's funeral procession, crystallized the visual tropes of Bernhardt's hypersexualized persona in an 8-foot-tall oil portrait, in the Petit Palais, by the way, the soon-to-be fashionable thin body with its serpentine pose, the racy chic of her corsetless gowns, the passionate love for wild birds and animals, feathers and furs. 2 years later, Bernhardt exhibited her marble portrait bust of Abema. Although it's still little known, Bernhardt was a painter and a highly accomplished sculptor, often exhibiting and selling her work in the same city in which she was performing. Not only did she show regularly at the Salon, Paris's official exhibition space from 1874 to 1891, she received an honorable mention for Après la tempête, which you see on the right, After the Storm, in 1876. These skillful works scarcely prepare us for her more unconventional and vanguard productions, including a series of marine and plant-inspired works, like Algae, which are well ahead of their time. And this is in the exhibition, and it's quite large and fabulous. And then there's the astonishing, fantastic inkwell self-portrait as Sphinx, executed in bronze the year before she starred in Octave Feuillet's play, Le Sphinx. Bernhardt's winged upper body hovering over a bat-festooned receptacle for ink with a hole in her skull. Oh, I'm sorry. I think you can just see up here. For her pen. Here we glimpse Bernhardt's and her generation's fascination with the macabre, which brings us back to the actress's body. Spectacularized on stage and in the public imagination, Bernhardt's serpentine form was subject to continuous scrutiny and satire, if not worse, ranging from benignly humorous to misogynist, homophobic, and anti-Semitic, read racist. Such characters and texts had the effect of policing norms of appearance and behavior for women by showing what a reputable woman should not be. In the light vein, Bernhardt was dubbed the skinniest woman in France when plumpness was fashionable. Instead of camouflaging her thinness, however, she accentuated it, wearing form-fitting gowns that adhered closely to her skeletal form and sporting cascading trains. Many of these images show her somewhat emaciated figure in the form of a spiral, as we see it here in particularly ethereal form in André Gilles' caricature of Sarah Bernhardt as Chimera. But the skinny ones, that you see in the middle, Skeleton Sarah, she's caricatured as a telegraph pole, a broomstick, and it goes on and on. Bernhardt was a fashionista with an ever-vigilant eye toward publicity. At home in the studio, she wore a white satin pantsuit designed by Charles Frederick Worth. Eat your heart out, Hillary. In all seasons, apparently, she strolled around. I'm sorry, that was the white satin pantsuit. And note the shoes, they'll come back later. In all seasons, apparently, she strolled around town in this ermine capelet. Perhaps she wore it with her bat hat. We know that she often attached 6 boggle-eyed chameleons to her attire du jour. The lizards, by the way, were just part of her extensive menagerie, funded at least in part through the sale of her sculpture. At one time, it also included 1 parrot, a monkey, 3 dogs, a cheetah, and a wolfhound. On stage, her costumes were an essential part of the spectacle, as we see when Bernhardt played Theodora, the Empress of Byzantium, On the left, a photo, and on the right, one of the many ensembles she wore in this lavish production, including the double eagle crown, a velour and metal inset with opals, amethysts, and turquoises, and the cape embroidered with silk thread and studded with 40 pounds of beads. Bernhardt also commissioned stage as well as personal jewelry from the fin de siècle's top Art Nouveau designers. Mucha, who designed both the snake bracelet on the left and the poster on the right, a Parisian transplant from Czechoslovakia, was responsible for her astonishing snake bracelet, studded with diamonds, rubies, opals, and inlaid enamel. I actually was amazed that we got it from my Sarah Bernhardt show in 2005. It came hand-carried in a specially designed case by a curator from Japan, with his translator, I should add. And this snake bracelet, studded with diamonds, rubies, opals, and inlaid enamel, attached to her middle finger, and then it snaked up her forearm, where the serpent's tail, made of individual gold links, slithered each time she moved her hand. And you see an approximation of it in Mucha's poster of Bernhardt as Medea. René Lalique designed the pearl-encrusted diadem Bernhardt wore in La Princesse Lointaine, the faraway princess, displayed in the photograph on the left, and Mucha's poster for a banquet honoring the actress. Finally, right here, the spectacular waterfall pendant with diamonds and irregular opals on the left. And you can see the waterfall bisecting the middle. And these are all little diamond studs. And these kind of unshaped opals on either side. That was a collaboration between the extraordinary jeweler Georges Fouquet, Mucha, and Desrosiers. And then on the right, a piece by Lalique, the pine cone chalice, which blends jewelry and glass techniques. These are, to me, among the many tour de force Art Nouveau objects in the exhibition. When we expand the representation of Bernhardt's body to images not sanctioned by her, the fact that the actress, like her mother, is Jewish is by far the most salient. In spite of her birth, Bernhardt was baptized and raised a Catholic, facts that did nothing to shield her from anti-Semitic attack. Among the many ethnic stereotypes we find in images of the actress are so-called Jewish features, including the hooked nose, enlarged ears, frizzy hair, which Bernhardt reports in her autobiography was likened to, quote, Negro's wool. And also the putative penchant for money grubbing. Such racialized slurs are often conjoined with Bernhardt's many other affronts to the norm. On the left, Alfred Le Petit's La poule aux œufs d'or, or the hen who laid the golden eggs, pictures Bernhardt as a hen, but the word was also slang for slut. She appears with a huge pointed nose, a cone of unruly hair, wearing garters and a clinging dress, with its train lifted so as to expel golden eggs into a series of full baskets. These accumulate under the watchful eye of playwright Victorien Sardou, about whom more later. In Sarah Bernhardt as a Sphinx, on the right, Gilles coils her human form into a spiral ending with hooves, decorated with butterfly wings, a reference to the shoes she wore with her studio outfit. Armed with mallet, chisel, and palette, a mask of tragedy atop her head. Bernhardt is given the untamable hair, stereotypical Jewish nose and ear, characterizing the many anti-Semitic caricatures of her that appeared in French journals a decade before the Dreyfus affair. The surfeit of attributes in these images, like Bernhardt herself, exemplifies the plurality of her outrageousness. And then there are her publicity stunts. Capitalizing on the story that she slept in a coffin, as she herself details in her autobiography, the actress posed for and widely marketed this photograph when she was about 35. If you look closely, you'll recognize the bust of Abima that Bernhardt sculpted overlooking her prostrate body. She thus creates a distinctly feminized and modern inversion of Rembrandt's painting of Aristotle with a bust of Homer. The tragedian turns her female companion into a guardian figure at the crossroads of mortality and immortality. The photograph not only pays tribute to their personal relationship as lovers, but also to their shared identity, struggling against prescriptive assumptions about women and women artists in particular. It also slyly invokes the cult of invalidism and early death that marked the real lives of 19th century women and men. Such a reference is especially delicious inasmuch as Bernhardt had become a sensation at dying. As she expired on stage, she would often end by coughing up blood or falling into a dead faint. Infatuated critics insisted that she never died the same way twice, so people went back to see her again and again. By the time of this publicity photo, Bernhardt's talent for dying was so remarked upon that the final death agony was practically de rigueur. And you see an early version, the stage version of her dying as Camille, when it premiered in 1880 in the United States, and then a still from the 1912 film. You have to admit that as a tragic actress who died daily for a living, twice a day when there was a matinee, she had an unusual relationship to death. As I've argued elsewhere, Bernhardt's talent for dying on stage paradoxically freed her from expectations that she, who in her youth frequently exhibited symptoms of neurasthenia and tuberculosis, would die young, like her sister Regine, who succumbed to consumption. Bernhardt performed, rather than lived, the penance for her heroine's deviation from the straight and narrow, and neatly dispensed with having to live it herself. She would die happily in public, well into her 70s, on stage and on the screen. The practice of repeating what sells, in this case a death scene, is one that Bernhardt turned brilliantly to her advantage. In 1880, the actress, ever the bad girl, broke her contract at the Comédie Française. She was very expensively fined to perform at the Gaiety Theatre in London, then took off with her own company to the New World, where she introduced Alexandre Dumas' Fils Dame aux Camélias. It would become the most performed role of her North American tour. She died 65 times as Marguerite Gautier, and well over 3,000 times over the course of her career. Lucky for us that Bernhardt made movies late in her career, because I can jump ahead to 1912 and show you her most famous theatrical death in film. Watch this moment. Dead. Okay. So you might have noticed that it's silent. Bernhardt never lived to make a talkie. The woman with the golden voice never lived to make a talkie. Back in France, after her first trip to America, Bernhardt began her 20-year collaboration with playwright Victorien Sardou, who wrote 8 melodramas with her in mind, including La Tosca, which was a play for Bernhardt before it became an opera. He also wrote Theodora and Cleopatra. A number are inscribed. Let's see, Fedora, Theodora, Tosca, Gismonda, going on, are inscribed across Sardou's chest in the bronze bust Bernhardt made of him, which is fairly large and in the exhibition. The roles that he wrote for her would be among her most famous. In these years, Bernhardt became a theater manager, renting the Théâtre de l'Ambigu, buying an interest in the Théâtre de la Porte Saint-Martin, and purchasing the Théâtre de la Renaissance, where she was the sole producer and director. And before we move on to her fascinating career in theater management, I just wanted to point out that along with Theodora, you see her as Cleopatra on the right. In 1899, at age 56, she took a 25-year lease on the Théâtre de Paris on the Place du Châtelet in Paris. It would later bear her name, the Théâtre Sarah Bernard. Under Vichy, I might add, it became and still is the Théâtre de la Ville. In short, Bernhardt became a one-woman dramatic enterprise, a virtual Sarah Bernhardt Incorporated, the success of her plays guaranteed through constant repetition and reproduction. One US review even likened her repertory to Henry Ford's assembly line. Quote, year after year, Victorien Sardou turned out a new vehicle for her talent, as they turn out motor cars, all on the same lines, but each year's model a slight mechanical improvement on the last. The actress had a prescient grip on repetition in ways that uncannily simulate new reproductive technologies. During her first American tour, she went to Menlo Park, New Jersey to have her voice recorded by Thomas Alva Edison on the newly invented photograph. You see her here. I'm not sure she's listening to her own voice, but she may be. Before she died in Paris, she had done 9 tours of the Americas, including 4 billed as farewell tours. Bernhardt's turn to melodrama took her from the classical theaters of France to the more popular realm of the Grand Boulevard. The publicity for these houses, in turn, brought her to Mucha, who was under contract to Bernhardt for 5 years, earning his first public recognition from the 7 posters he made to advertise her theatrical roles. The internationally famous style Mucha, became synonymous with the flowing organic lines, dreamy color, and abstracted patterns he defined in his very first poster of Bernhardt as Gismonda, here in the center, Camille, and La Samaritaine, the Good Samaritan. Adhering to the industrial model that Mucha originally conceived in 1895, each of his posters is wonderfully fresh, yet they all share a certain formula. A central figure framed by an arch or a circle, accompanied by a prop, and this is my fave down here. Can you see it, the disembodied hand? Where'd the pointer go? Anyway, it's just above Théâtre de la Renaissance on the left. With blocks above and below containing the names of both the play and the theater. In appropriating the advertising strategies of the cabaret, Bernhardt allied herself with popular entertainment, as she did through her move to melodrama. The poster was celebrated on the left as a new democratic art form. For others, its very accessibility made it an emblem of socialist and anti-establishment ferment. When one of the foremost illustrators of the fin de siècle, Jules Charest, showed Bernhardt advertising face powder, the brand name La Diaphane refers to its transparency, his audience would recognize the negative associations of makeup with actresses and prostitutes. As a charrette, one of Charest's archetypal glamour girls, Bernhardt could be a threatening example of commercial upward mobility. Over the course of her storied career, she would advertise everything from bullion to hats, from cigarettes to real estate in the Bronx. On the screen, from left to right, we have cookies, soap, and absinthe. There's a certain irony in Bernhardt's embrace of the popular. Following a career in the sacred precincts of the Comédie Française, her move to the boulevard, the music hall, and eventually to vaudeville and film has the look of a distinctly contrarian downward mobility. In fact, it is Bernhardt's responsiveness to new technologies, her involvement with film in particular, which from the area of the comédie might be said to occupy a space called the gutter, that have made her immortal. It was both a continuous devolution and a staggering success story, documented at every turn by her own publicity, as well as the heated responses of enthusiasts and detractors. By way of conclusion, I want to throw a spotlight on Bernhardt's late career, and particularly on another dimension of her heretical body, aging and infirmity. First, through her increased recourse to breeches roles, second, through disability, and finally, through her role in the burgeoning film industry. She had an uncanny ability to keep herself in the public eye right up to the time of her death. Over the course of a nearly 60-year career, the most feminine actress of her time caused a sensation in breeches roles. Although it was common for actresses to play men in the 19th century, Bernhardt's excessive femininity gave her male impersonations a special thrill. Between the ages of 52 and 60, she took on 3 great male leads in Alfred de Musset's Lorenzaccio, which you see on the right in Mucha's poster, Shakespeare's Hamlet, and which you see on the left, and Edmond Rostand's L'Aiglon. By the end of her life, she had 18 breeches roles in her repertory, double the number of her early career. It was her performance as the young Florentine troubadour that we saw before, which is now on the right, that brought her critical acclaim at the Odeon in 1869, when she would have been in her late 20s. Just over 30 years later, Bernhardt's performance as the young L'Aiglon, or the little eaglet, the sobriquet of Napoleon's son, the Duc de Reichstadt, seems to have reignited the desire of many to see her again in the most celebrated female ingenue roles of her youth, especially Marguerite Gautier, regardless of her age. In any event, the little eaglet, in which you see her wearing the most famous costume by Paul Poiret, which is kind of white spandex, was hands down the most successful of all her breeches roles. One of the most enduring elements of Bernhardt's legend is that she had a wooden leg. Although she did have a prosthesis, she never wore it. She preferred to have herself carried or placed strategically on stage in the one act she continued to perform. Here, in a still photograph from a production of Phèdre after 1915, you can see that she's missing her right leg. Bernhardt lost it to uremia after unsuccessful treatments for an injury compounded by a fall in Rio de Janeiro at the end of a performance of La Tosca. The mattress wasn't waiting off stage when the heroine throws herself from a parapet at the close of the final act. When the actress finally had it cared for, the treatment was incorrect. She developed gangrene and had her leg amputated just below the hip. After her recovery, she went to Verdun to visit and perform for troops stationed at that bloody outpost. No matter what a publicity hound she was, I love her for this. She arrived, as you see her here, carried on a litter, decorated in the Louis XV style, swathed in furs and looking every inch a queen. A sensorial extravaganza on the battlefield, one can only imagine the effect she had on the wounded, and fellow amputees in particular. Interestingly, recent scholarship is paying renewed attention to Bernhardt's late career, the ways in which she took charge of it through 40 years of theatrical management parallels her use of other reproductive technologies, the photograph, the poster, the record player, the souvenir industry, and last but not least, the cinema. But also the ways in which her breeches roles, more than confounding gender, which in and of itself can be thrilling, confound age. Here she is as 5 times l'Aiglon. And here's Hamlet on the right. In other words, I'm going to suggest that these roles function as a female anti-ageist strategy. While never erasing her aging body, the actress was still able to convey youth and to conjure the acting feats of the young female actress she had been through costumes, agile movement, and vocal flexibility. To quote an article published in Harper's Bazaar in 1902 entitled "The Shelf," Bernhardt did what very few men and women between the ages of 60 and 70 years, end quote, managed to do. She managed to escape a certain humiliating experience, which is known as being laid on the shelf. By taking on roles that challenged ideas about female aging, through performances that were at once cross-gendered and cross-aged, Bernhardt continued to maintain her youthful femininity in the eyes of her public. In a similar way, Bernhardt's recourse to film might be seen as rejuvenation rather than the last recourse of an aging actress. You'll remember that film was in the gutter at that time. One theater scholar recently wrote, "Film is not a record of a waning performance practice and or a way to see an aged theatrical actress, but an innovative way to ensure global visibility in a period of industrial change." After making a 45-second film of part of the duel scene in Hamlet in 1900, Bernhardt went on to make a series of longer ones, including Queen Elizabeth on the right and Camille on the top. By the way, Queen Elizabeth Bernhardt here is about to expire by falling full face forward onto the pile of plump cushions below. Bernhardt often timed one acts of the same production in vaudeville to accord with a movie's release, asserting that people having seen the film would still more strongly desire to see the real presentation, the real being theater. Adolf Zukor, who helped launch the famous Players film company which released Queen Elizabeth, transformed it into Paramount Pictures, thanks to the proceeds. Sarah Bernhardt established the template for show business icons as we know them. The first star with a name to star in movies, Bernhardt helped to legitimate the fledgling art form for actors from Theda Bara to Nicole Kidman. The startling number of evocations of Bernhardt in Hollywood film testifies to her reach. Even a partial list includes Theda Bara, John Barrymore, Judy Garland, whom you see on the left, Joseph Cotten, Ginger Rogers on the right, Julie Andrews, Marilyn Monroe, Barbra Streisand via Fanny Brice, Nicole Kidman, and Annette Bening. So this is Garland imitating Bernhardt's L'Aiglon, badly I might add, in Babes on Broadway from 1941, and Ginger Rogers auditioning for the Comédie Française in a play about the young Sarah Bernhardt in the Barclays of Broadway from 1949. And finally, I'm going to show you a clip of Marilyn Monroe in The 7-Year Itch of 1955.
I had onions at lunch. I had garlic dressing at dinner. But he'll never know, because I stay kissing sweet the new dazzle-dent way.
You do that beautifully.
Thank you. You know, people don't realize that every time I show my teeth on television, I'm appearing before more people than Sarah Bernhardt appeared before in her whole career. Something to think about.
Oh, it certainly is.
I wish I were old enough to have seen Sarah Bernhardt. Was she magnificent?
Clearly, the girl, Monroe's character in the movie, not to mention writer-director Billy Wilder, chose to ignore Sarah Bernhardt's role in film. And also, I should add that Tom Ewell, her co-star, would have had to have seen Bernhardt at age 7. Several days before her death, at the ripe age of 79, in 1923, Sarah Bernhardt was working with Sacha Guitry on a film entitled La Voyante, or The Fortune Teller, and you see her here literally a couple days before she died. Bernhardt saw the future, and it saw her. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. I'd be delighted to take questions or comments of any kind.
You mentioned that Edison had recorded her. Have you ever heard any of the recordings? Do they exist?
The quality of the recording is pretty bad, and even cleaning them up, it's hard to say how accurate they could be. They're very strange to late 20th century and 21st century ear. I can assure you of that. They're a little bit on the high-pitched side, but they do have this incredible rhythm, because often she's performing in verse. And I found them very powerful, despite their strangeness, I think I have to say. And they're probably a little bit hard, but not impossible to hear in this country. For the films and the sound, Paris was really the place where I needed to spend time. And fortunately, we were able to get some loans in those arenas. Does that answer your question? Great.
When she was acting in the United States, were they playing in French or in translation?
I love this question. Bernhardt never performed in anything other than French. And I have to recount a teeny little anecdote. It's my favorite one from Mark Twain, who is one of many fans, including Sigmund Freud, Colette, Alice B. Toklas, their, legion, her fans. And Mark Twain went to see her and came out of the theater saying, I thought I understood every word she said until I left the theater and realized I didn't speak a word of French. So what's fascinating to me about this is that what we find very histrionic today, this highly physicalized style of acting and declaiming, actually worked really, really well. I mean, she was like signing what she was saying in a way.
In her Britches roles, were there other women in those roles as well, or was it just her and a bunch of men?
No. There was a very famous one in the U.S. named Charlotte Cushman. There were others quite renowned in England. I can't there were certainly in the more popular arenas of entertainment, women doing breeches roles in France. But when I think right off the top of my head, nobody with the stature of Bernhardt in France comes to mind. But certainly, Cushman had an enormous stature. I mean, did classical roles, breeches roles, as well as Bernhardt in the 19th century.
How did you come to be interested in Sarah Bernhardt?
How did I come to make an exhibit?
No, but to be interested in her particularly.
Oh, thank you. I love that question too. It's a very bizarre story, which I'm happy to share. In my Angro book, which Mary Weaver Chapin was kind enough to mention, I wrote a chapter on a portrait of a Rothschild baroness that was painted by Ang in 1848. And the reason I wrote about that particular portrait was because I knew the female portraits of that period very, very well. He was very famous for his female society portraits. And I just thought, that's a very weird-looking Anglo society portrait. She's the only woman with whom I want to have a conversation of these sitters. And I said to myself, not even speaking aloud, really said to myself, oh, I bet it's because she's Jewish. And then I started to do the research. So I started looking at all the biographies of Baroness Betty de Rothschild, Bathsheba de Rothschild. And there was nothing except about her husband, James, who founded the Parisian branch of the Rothschild Bank in Paris in the 19th century. And nothing about her being a distinguished conversationalist or in any way distinctive. And then I came across a criticism that said, describe the portrait by Ang. The sitter had two eyebrows à l'orientale, shaped like crow's wings. And I said, bingo, bingo. And this ended up being played out in literature of the time, all these stereotypes of Jewesses. And I had like 15 minutes of fame for this. I put Angre and Jew in the same sentence for the first time, right? So people like that. And then I got asked to contribute to an anthology that was going to be co-edited by two art historians that I really, really respect. And they said, okay, so we're writing about modern representations of Jews. And I said, well, I have nothing. But I decided I should dig around. And I thought, well, okay, I could do somebody French or somebody who's contemporary in the US, because those are my interests. And I thought Sarah Bernhardt and the comedian, stand-up, Sandra Bernhardt, whom you may not remember because she was like a flash in the pan, right? And then Sandra fell out because Sarah Bernhardt was so interesting. And so my very first essay on Sarah Bernhardt came out in 1995, and then I did the show in 2005, a decade later.
Thank you, Carol.
Thank you all so much. Thank you very much.